Hello, how are you?
I'm fine.
Good. So what's new with you? Do you have anything you want to present or talk about?
Like, I don't have anything to present, but for the open source, I have planned two things. Like, the first would be the approach that I had proposed earlier for the GSWAP, that is the dynamic hypergraph using four types of hyper edges: the functional hyper edge, the anastomosis, and the temporal and spatial one. And apart from this, the second one would be using an agentic model. Although I'm still exploring the potential side, but these two will be the direction that I want to work on.
Okay, that sounds good. I mean, we should talk about that more. The model with four hyper edges seems like it's, pretty much in line with DevoWorm. The agentic model, you could use that and you could actually combine that with a graph or a hypergraph. I think we've talked about that in the past with other people, but yeah, I'd have to sit down and think about that.
Yeah, like, and one more thing, like earlier, I had also shared the documentation for the functional and anastomosis table. So I'm planning to like upgrade them because they were only the logic behind that table. So I'm planning to upgrade them as well.
Okay, that sounds good.
Yes, sir.
Thank you.
Welcome.
Yeah, it's like so. Ashu's here, and Morgan and Jesse. Welcome. Okay, so today I want to talk about some papers later, some interesting ones on muscle modeling and things like that. Um, but first, I want to talk about the NetSci conference that's coming up this week. It's actually ongoing, and it's in Boston, where Jesse is. So this is the main conference for network science every year. They have NetSci. So we were interested. Actually, this group is interested in two conferences and just kind of watching what happens. There's NetSci, which is network science, and that's more kind of the science of networks. There's some applied stuff, but it's usually like a mix of social science, natural science, and technological networks. Not a lot of engineering, but like a lot of physics, like the statistical physics of networks. Not a lot of social networks in the. Yeah, there we go, Boston. That's nice. Thank you, Jesse. Um, but also, we have different types of theoretical questions that people ask with respect to social networks and biological networks, and has very much that idea of sort of universality that we see with approaches like network science, where you can take a sort of a structure and you can take the statistics and you can apply it to any kind of system. So it could be a social system, it could be a biological system. As long as you have nodes that you can define and edges that you can define. So nodes are usually units that interact, and then the edges are the interactions. You calculate those, and then there are these larger statistical properties of that structure. So this is, we've actually presented a couple times at NetSci in the past. And then, of course, there's the Graph Neural Networks Conference in December, which is more sort of computer science and focused on graph neural networks. So that's a nice conference, but they usually don't have outside submissions. They usually pick their presenters, and then people will maybe do, a lot of virtual attendance and then get the information that way. And because it's kind of a smaller field, there's a lot of repetition and a lot of repetition at network science as well. But because it's not an infinite field, so you get a lot of diversity in network science, people working on different types of problems. So it's really kind of a nice thing to check out. So this is NetSci2026. It's in Boston and it's happening this week. So this is the first day. and they have a Blue Sky presence. So this is their Blue Sky uh, feed, and they'll put images from the conference in this feed. They don't have anything now because it's the first day, but they'll have like different talks, and they'll take pictures and screenshots and things and put them up here. It's always good to follow the social media component of the conference because you can get kind of a peek into what's going on in the sessions. So they have a program. The full program is here. Speakers. I'll talk about some of the keynote speakers here. So it looks like they have some of the classics. And what I mean by that is they have Stephen Strogatz and Duncan Watts. So these are the two people who published the Strogatz and Watts paper in 1998. And that was the first time that people would really characterize small world networks. And so they did this on some social network data, looking at the sort of the structure of a social network and thinking about how those networks are connected, how you have these hubs that connect multiple parts of the network together, and they provide these shortcuts across the network. So if you send a message to any random person in your social group, they might get that message in 3 or 4 exchanges. I mean, any other person at random, they might get that message in 3 or 4 exchanges. If you interact directly with a hub, or in C. elegans connectome terms, what people call the rich club of neurons, you'll receive that message much quicker, maybe in 1 exchange or 2 exchanges. So those hubs, they're highly connected with all different parts of the network, and they serve as a shortcut for message passing or for other types of communication. So this is I don't know, we're not at the 30th anniversary of that paper, but we're pretty close. Then Albert Laszlo Barbasi and Reka Albert published a paper in 1999 on a similar set of phenomena, thinking about small world networks and other types of statistical physics approaches to networks. And so this is, they were talking about scale-free networks in their paper. And scale-free networks that's another way to characterize the complexity of a network. In this case, that there's no characteristic length scale of a network. So that means that any node that you sample has a variety of different connectivity regimes, but it's not a random network. That's the important part. It's not random, but it's also not deterministic. And so it's, you can think about like complexity theory here for a moment and think about how people look at things that sit between order and chaos and how there are all sorts of interesting properties of those kinds of systems. So we're not quite at the 30th anniversary of that, but we're getting there. Then there's Young-Yul Ahn, who did a lot of work in the past with like Twitter networks and things like that at Indiana University, and then now he's at University of Virginia. Some other people here in a lot of different areas. Petra Vertes, who does stuff with neuroimaging. Some people doing things with public health and other types of, a lot of online networks are very easy to analyze. So you can, get data from things like Twitter or things like that, or well, you used to be able to do that. Or, other types of very large socio-technical networks. And those analytics then can be used to build these networks. Yeah, so it looks like a pretty nice slate of people. And then there's, of course, some applied math involved in network science. And this is where, they're looking at geometric learning and things like that. That's kind of this overlap with graph neural networks. So I don't think they have a lot of graph neural networks here, but they do have, I don't know if they have a formal track for it, but it's worth mentioning since this is kind of a very interesting area. and there's this natural sort of fit between network science, so it's applied in the world, and then graph neural networks as it's sort of theorized and applied in the world. But people, there's this kind of disconnect between the two communities, so it'd be nice to have this sort of continuity. So I'm going to do the program overview. Today and tomorrow, June 1 and June 2, there are a lot of the satellites happening. So there's network neuroscience, which always happens. It's a very good side conference. It's pretty big. It's one of the main draws there. Um, Several years ago, OpenWorm did a session at Network Neuroscience, and people were really excited about it. So there's network geometry. There is temporal network. So people, I know that we have one person from DevoWorm, Jayadratha, who worked on temporal graphs, and we're kind of working on a paper on that, finishing it up. We're trying to get it out. So that's kind of an interesting thing, I think, for our group. There's higher order network science, algorithmic fairness in network science, which of course is a topic that, because if you're using algorithms to find communities within the network, or using them to do other things, and especially in social applications, this is an important topic. There's causal network science, and beyond APIs. So when you're getting this data to build networks, especially in social settings, you need to think about how you're getting it, the technical aspects, but also how to do this more efficiently. So usually people would, like back in the days when they used Twitter as a test bed for network science, they would just use an API, and there was an easy to download API, and you could use that pretty easily. But then that went away, and that put a lot of people kind of in a jam because they couldn't get data to do their research. So there are all sorts of ways to get this type of data. This one, CPIN2, critical phenomenon in networks. So critical phenomena in networks, of course, this is criticality, and these other types of issues in network science and in complexity theory that's addressed in the Barbasi and Elbert paper, actually, from 1999, and has been a robust research area ever since. So CPIN2 is a second edition of an interdisciplinary forum dedicated to advancing the study of criticality and adaptive real-world network systems. So this is, I don't know if they have their program up. Let's see. Okay, yeah, they have a couple of speakers here. This first one, various types of phase transitions and complex networks. So looking at phase transitions and changes, sudden disruptive changes perhaps, or discrete changes. Another talk on phase transitions. Another one, phase transitions and homophilic social contagion. And there's one, predicting and preventing dominant agents in decentralized networks. Then there's beyond criticality, collective function near transitions in multidimensional phase space. This one, canalization drives robustness in the evolution of collective intelligence under noise. This is particularly interesting from a developmental point of view because they're using canalization. And there is this type of computational tool called a canalization function, which is something that we can talk about later. But basically, it's a function that it's kind of like a fitness function in genetic algorithms, but it uses this idea of canalization, or creating developmental trajectories and kind of buffering those trajectories so that you have this tree of different options. So you start off at the top with the least differentiated system, and then you go down to the first differentiation point, and you can follow one of two trajectories away from that point. And then you keep having these branching events as you go down the tree, and you end up in a place that's highly selective and highly specialized. And that mimics the developmental process, and you can use that to mimic development. And so there's this whole set of canalization functions that we can use to simulate that. And I imagine they're using something very similar here. And then there's this early detection of critical transitions before epileptic seizures. I'm assuming this is neuroimaging. And then coordination and fragility in production networks. So that looks like an interesting. Okay, so, and then there's, of course, let's see if we can look at this temporal network session. Let's see who's there. Website. And this is temporal networks or tenant. And so this is where we're looking at temporal networks, which model systems where entities and interactions evolve over time. Unlike static networks, they capture how changing structures influence key processes by incorporating the timing, order, and duration of connections. So when we're talking in the group about the synaptic data set from Whitfleet, this is an example of something that we can talk about as the order and duration of connections. We also, when we talk about developmental networks or embryo networks, we're talking about cells that appear at different times, and cells divide. So you have two daughter cells, which are now new cells in the network or new nodes in the network, and an old cell which disappears, so that node disappears. So you have all sorts of structural changes like that. So that's what they're focused on here. And so they're interested in different applications ranging from mobility routing to disease spreading. And then of course the ability to get data on these things is important. And this is kind of one of the key things in network science, is being able to get the data that you need in the format that you need. So it's not just enough to have like open data. You need to have something that's amenable to that format. As we've talked about in the group, of course. I think Ashu knows exactly what I'm talking about. So let's see. Let's see if there's a program. So yeah, they'll be talking about things like link prediction in temporal networks and hypergraphs, understanding temporal networks through diffusion and flows, role of nodes and links and spreading processes on temporal higher order networks. This one, temporal graph isomorphism and the expressivity of temporal graph neural networks. This is, of course, very much overlapping with the graph neural networks workshop that they have in December. All right, so I think that's enough about that. And then, of course, we have some more satellites. It looks like those satellites, some of them continue network neuroscience tenant. There's NetSci which is always good. This is an educational group that meets at Network Science every year, and they focus on education in network science. This one, Friends, Frameworks, Research, and other, I don't know what this acronym stands for. Frameworks, Research, and Applications in Complex Networks with Signed Edges. So, a very niche topic. And then they picked out this convoluted acronym. So that's in the afternoon. Then they have Network Science Informs AI, which is it looks interesting. And then Networks and Science of Science, which is this meta science stuff. And then we have other ones, Statistical Inference for Network Science. NetBiomed, which is always interesting. I've presented at that. Networks in Biology and Medicine. TopoNets 26. TopoNets is about the topology of networks. UrbanNet, which is about urban systems. Physical networks, and ethics in network science research. Let's see, networks and science of science. I know Jesse's interested in meta science. So the speakers here, let's see if we have a schedule here. Okay. So there are papers such as Measuring the Hidden Impact of Scientific Tools and Methods. Then there's the Structure of Organized Skepticism. Academic support networks reflect doctoral experience and productivity. The emergence and evolution of semantic complexity. This is about an urban digital twin. Envisioning intelligences, discussions about collective intelligence visualizations. This is like swarm intelligence and things like that. The hidden structure of innovation networks. Do women benefit more than men from co-authoring with a prominent researcher? Status or structure. What drives changes in research performance after institutional migration? Then there's structural changing concept networks. Predicts change of scientific elites. This one, massive citation count distortion due to incorrect citation association for articles in online only Springer Nature journals. This is an issue about we were talking about citation counts and things like that in the past, where there's this whole debate in meta science about like people padding their citation counts or citing papers in art and the literature, or just making mistakes and how that impacts science. And you can do this very easily. You can build these citation networks where you can examine that. And then finally, does interdisciplinary collaboration improve funding success? Evidence from embedding-based measures. So these are all very important and timely topics. Okay, so I think that's all for that day. And they go to a Red Sox game on Tuesday. The social stuff is always interesting. So then we go to Wednesday and Thursday, and this is the meat of the conference with the keynotes and the panel talks and all of that. There's the Barbasi and Elbert keynote. There's the Munduchin keynote. Then there's some lightning talks. Then there are a couple more talks. The second lightning talk, and then the parallel sessions, of course, biological networks, network epidemics and spreading, network theory, social networks, higher order and multi-layer networks, algorithms, inference, and reconstruction. Then I think that's it for Wednesday, and then the next day you have more keynotes, more parallel sessions, including science of science, social networks, economic networks, dynamics and control network theory. This panel, which is publishing in the age of AI, which is timely, of course. More keynotes, the Watson-Strogatz keynote. Then you have different parallel sessions. So they have like, social networks, actually, I think 4 parallel sessions where, they want to fit in all the people, but they have to split it up across time because they only have a certain amount of time in any one block. This is interesting. Network renormalization, and machine learning and AI. And then on Friday, there's the Society Awards. So the Euler Award goes to Albert Laszlo Barbasi. The Erdo Shereni Prize goes to Laurent Hébert de France, who's actually does a lot of interesting things with community, like sort of community detection, and some work on open source communities, which I've seen in the past at this conference. Outstanding Service Award, Yamir Moreno, and then announcement of Network Society Fellows. So congratulations to those people. Then there were some more parallel sessions, biological networks, temporal networks, dynamics and control, economics networks, and then a few more invited talks and keynotes, and then the final set of parallel sessions on Friday afternoon. So that's the NetSci conference for this year. I think that's, a lot of interesting stuff going on. And I don't know, it's expensive to get in, so I don't know if you can go just visit. But it's, it's always a good time. And a lot of interesting topics come out of that. Let's see. We had some things in the chat. Jesse had his GIF of Boston, of course. Jesse says, hidden structure of innovation networks. Interesting. Meta science. Yeah, the science of science. And then I know Dan Elton, who is trying to work on metascience observatory efforts. Yeah, that's I think that's something that they've presented in NetSci in the past, the network observatory stuff, but I'm not sure. Looks like we have two more people here, Barshan and Erin. Hello.
Hello.
Hi, how are you?
Good, thanks.
I haven't seen you in a while.
Yeah, it's been a minute. I've been busy doing things, living life. It's nice to be here again. Thanks for allowing me.
Oh, no problem. Yeah. Thank you. Okay, so I don't know if we had any other things we wanted to talk about before I get into our papers for the week.
Brief question. Hi, Erin. I know that event's here in Boston. I don't know when. I don't know. Is there any part of it that's virtual online that could be easily attended? Do you know? Because I didn't know anything about it. I'm not planning to do anything with it, but I was just curious.
Yeah.
Yeah.
I believe they have some sessions on YouTube, but I'm not sure. They have the social media. They have like Blue Sky, and they have some things. So they might come up with some links to like a YouTube channel. I know a lot of conferences will put things on YouTube.
Yeah.
You know, not necessarily interactive stuff, but just so you can see different presentations.
Okay. Yeah, I'm clearly I've got a lot elsewhere on our plate to sort out, but it's cool. I'm glad that you mentioned it all.
Yeah. Yeah. Well, anyways, so that's the annual conference. So yeah, why don't we go to our papers? So we have two papers. So these are both on musculoskeletal systems. So of course these are systems where you have muscles that are moving, usually in concert with one another. It's usually multiple muscle, like different muscle groups moving. They're usually receiving a signal from the brain, and it's usually in the service of doing some sort of behavior. So, if we think about when we kick our leg, or when we, make a ballistic movement like throw a baseball, or, do something like that, it's we have to coordinate a bunch of muscles into a muscle group, and then we have to send a signal from the brain to that muscle to tell it to move. We also have to get feedback from the environment, and we use that feedback to modulate muscle activity. And all of this is a dynamical system that, has to adjust itself in real time and has to be continually modified. So if we're walking along a treadmill, we have this gait and we have this sort of repetitive motion. That repetitive motion is not like deterministic or constant. There are some variations in it that are quite interesting from a dynamical systems perspective. And some of that is due to, these postural changes that you make during that movement are due to different things going on in the interactions between the environment and the muscle. For example, you might walk over some terrain that's rough versus smooth, or you might change direction, or you might start to get fatigue in your muscles and you change the way you walk, or you might experience pain, so you kind of adjust your gait, things like that. So these are all kind of, there's a form of learning that's involved. You have to learn certain movements a lot of times. And those systems are adaptive. The systems are, they're these complex systems that continually change, and they're part of sort of an embodied phenotype. So there's a good degree of embodiment in these kind of systems as well. And so in C. elegans, we've talked about some of the movements that we study. So in C. elegans, we have a very simple system where we have small movement circuits. So we talked, I think, last week or a couple weeks ago about forward and backward movements. So in C. elegans, C. elegans doesn't have a lot of movements in its repertoire, but it does do these forward movements and backwards movements. So, there's a movement initiated where the worm goes forward, a movement initiated where the worm moves backwards, and then that's driven by some circuit of maybe about 6 or 7 neurons. And so the circuit changes as the movements change. So the forward movement is driven by one set of neurons. The backwards movement is driven by another set of neurons, which overlaps. And so those neurons then encode that movement. In C. elegans, it's actually pretty simple. It's just that those neurons are active, that circuit is active, and it sort of drives that movement. In the human brain, where we have a much more complex set of networks controlling movement, like limb movements and other types of movements, there are different types of activations that we have to look for. So it's not just a set of neurons, it's population-based coding and population-based activity. And so when we have these much larger connectomes, we have much more complex networks that have to be engaged. But nevertheless, they interact with the muscles, and there's skill learning, basically, where in C. elegans, movement isn't really skill learning. It's a sort of deterministic thing where if that the muscles, they twitch during embryonic development and then come online as they connect to those subnetworks of the connectome, and then it's just basically triggered. So if you have a forward movement, that circuit is on. If the forward movement stops, that circuit is off. In something like human movement, you usually have musculoskeletal systems that connect with these populations of neurons, and there's skill involved in a lot of these movements. So if you're learning like dance moves, that's a skill. If you're a baby and you're learning to walk, that's also a skill. And the skill learning, it's not immediate. It takes time to learn. And there's a lot of, in infants that are learning to walk, they do something called motor babbling, where they kind of explore their environment. They maybe move their feet around a little bit. They might try to, stumble around to try to learn how to walk. And so that's part of this skill learning. And so what these two papers are about is applying some sort of learning technique to acquire musculoskeletal skills in a modeled system of human movement. And then, of course, the idea is to apply this to something like a robot or something like a prosthetic device where that connection between the brain and the muscle has been cut in some way. And so we want to restore that. So this first paper is about curriculum-based reinforcement learning, and the next paper is about an arrival method. So let me get into this. This is a paper from Neuron. This is called Acquiring Musculoskeletal Skills with Curriculum-Based Reinforcement Learning. So one of the things they have in these Neuron articles is they have a graphical abstract. So let's go over that. So what they're using in this paper is they're using a biomechanical simulator of the human hand. So you have a hand, you have muscles, you have tendons, you have the hand. The hand has a certain shape, and it's trying to manipulate these two balls. So it's trying to balance these two balls within the fingers, and it's trying to manipulate those things. So there's a lot of muscle activity that goes into that, a lot of fine motor control. And it's a skill because, that fine motor control, especially tuning that to make sure that you don't squeeze the balls too hard or they fall between your fingers is important. So you can simulate this in a biomechanical simulator. They have very good biomechanical simulators for human anatomy. That's, the one part of it, though. We need to have a learning algorithm. And so we have reinforcement and curriculum learning as our method. And they use this method called static to dynamic stabilization, or SDS. And this is where you have this static system that you're trying to infer into a dynamical system or a dynamic system. So the static system is where you have two states, maybe, and you're transitioning between the states. And then dynamic system is where you have these states over time and the evolution of between states. So you're trying to do this sort of stabilization where the dynamical system becomes more stable than it otherwise would be. And then you have the neural network model of the motor system. So you have a bunch of observations. They go into this memory, and then there's action through the neural network. And it encode, basically you can extract different movement states from that. Okay, so then they analyze a learned motor system. So they look at an actual learned motor system. They look at the learned synergies. So the synergies are the coordination between muscle groups. So muscle synergy would be like if you're walking, you have certain muscles in your leg that are co-activated at the same time. And if one of those muscles is damaged, then you have a problem moving. You might limp, or you might have to use a prosthetic device to even walk at all. And so you have to have all those muscles co-activating and in fully functional shape to do that. Sometimes, if maybe one of your muscles is strained, you might compensate by moving to another muscle, and you have like this new muscle synergy that emerges, which is maybe not as efficient as the old muscle synergy, but it's still kind of it basically works in the same way. So, like remember when we talked about the C. elegans paper where we had talked about different types of movement observations, and we wanted to find kind of the movement states or the sort of the postures of C. elegans as it was moving. And they used this approach called eigenworms, and we talked about that. This is similar to what they're doing here. They're looking at a principal component analysis of these learned synergies, and they're extracting out, you could call them like eigenhands or something, where you have the muscle synergies kind of in their shape as they're moving. And so each of these configurations of the hand are the shapes of the hand during a movement. And so it's transitioning between these states. So what we're doing here is we're getting these static states, and we're extrapolating this out to a dynamical system or a dynamic state where the muscle synergies are moving in this form. So it's like going from a static snapshot of the hand at any given time during the movement to a complete movement. Then, of course, you can analyze the neural dynamics. So what generates this movement are populations of neurons, and you can get these kind of manifolds that are of different shapes. And so this is just a surface where we have activations, and so we can get these neural dynamics for different layers of this network, and we can show what those correspond with movements. Then we have, of course, our muscle synergies, and usually we have muscle synergies for different types of movements, but sometimes we use movements in different ways. So we share synergies across different types of movements. So if you're like walking or you're dancing or you're running, those are all, they're sharing muscle synergies, parts of different synergies. And so, this is something that you can transfer across tasks. So if you learn how to walk, you can also run much more easily than if you had to also learn to run from scratch. So the walking leads to running. Running, of course, is its own skill, but you can transfer some things that were acquired during when you learned how to walk to running. And so this is where we have this task transfer. And this, of course, is a challenge for a lot of machine learning tasks because, being able to do skill transfer is a little bit difficult. And so we have our neural network here. We extract principal components from this. And then we have this low-dimensional reinforcement learning policy that emerges that tells us kind of how to govern these synergies with respect to a behavior. So basically, the transfer learning is basically this low-dimensional policy based on sort of movements of the muscle synergies in context of the hand. Then you have synergies that are highly task dependent and generalize poorly across tasks. That's their finding. They show the number of principal components for each task. So this is task performance on the y-axis and number of principal components on the x-axis. And then they look at these two tasks. So they're looking at how these transfer across tasks. So we have, I think, task 1 and task 1. So they're comparing task 1 and task 1. So task performance rises early and it stays up there. So the number of PCs. And then you have fewer PCs as we go through our tasks. So task 2 and task 2 show a similar signature here in task 2, but then we have very poor performance for the other tasks. So these synergies that they're finding through this low dimensional policy space is highly task dependent. So any task will autocorrelate with itself, but then other tasks won't give you very much information. We can see that from the number of principal components. So that's kind of what this graph is describing. So it generalizes poorly across tasks. So the highlights are then we succeed in training a musculoskeletal model on an object manipulation task. You're manipulating these balls in the hand. The static to dynamic stabilization curriculum is inspired by coaching practice. So this is like in sports when you have a coach, where the coach will tell you, kind of the steps in isolation, where, you do these things, sort of the fundamentals, and then it's up to the person to put it together and do this sort of in a dynamic way. So the static part is where you learn about the sort of fundamentals. And then you kind of, as you do things, you learn how to put that all together. So this is, of course, this continual learning where you have to actually participate in this thing and then build the skill from that. So it's very much like, you could say learning by doing, or this very highly embodied sort of approach to learning where, and of course, this is this debate about embodiment, where you absolutely need embodiment for these types of tasks and to teach a machine or an artificial system these types of tasks. Akin to experimental data, SDS, which is the static to dynamic stabilization, learns low-dimensional kinematic and kinetic spaces. So this is where if we look at experimental data, we can also replicate this sort of these low-dimensional spaces, both in terms of motor activity and movement activity. We can basically learn a low-dimensional version of that. So we learn the basic dynamic structure, but the thing is, refining that structure of the behavior is a different story. So, if you're thinking about if you're learning a skill, you might learn how to do that thing, but then your ability to get better at it or to refine your technique is the thing that's elusive here. And then finally, learned muscle synergies are highly task specific, and this generalized poorly, which we saw. And, one of the reasons for this is that sometimes muscle synergies, at least in these artificial systems, are based on learning a specific task. And so, being able to generalize to a new task is difficult. In the human body, if we're learning the difference between walking and running, our muscle synergy, we have a lot of different muscles available to us, and we have the benefit of evolution available to us. And, it's something that's kind of already there, so we just have to unlock it. But in artificial systems, you may need to create new muscle groups and put them into the simulation. And, the question is whether that low dimensional policy covers that, that new task or that new set of muscle groups. So I think that's, kind of a recap of this paper. So this is an interesting paper. I think we have some things in the chat here. So let's see. We go back up here. Okay, Erin said, haha. Great name, motor babbling. Yeah, it's a term that they just use in, it's supposed to be an analogous to in language learning where a baby babbles. And it's very similar because language production is a motor skill. So you're trying to coordinate your mouth as you're an infant, and that's basically the same thing. Oh, you're going to say something, Erin? Okay. Then Jesse says, was going to mention dance moves if you didn't come back in time to hear it. And then Erin said, I was thinking of those. Then Erin said, I like the observation that we need to maintain basically proprioception and relativity awareness during adaptation to the external stimuli. Yeah. So, I mean, this is a thing about like motor learning in like robots. I know people have probably seen videos where robots will do like, they have robots that do a lot of complex things like dance moves or something, and they often fall down. And it's about maintaining those sorts of sources of information about the environment. So if you don't have the proper proprioceptive feedback, or if you're not aware of your sort of immediate environment, or if you're not aware of kind of like the overarching framework for moving. I mean, you want to learn the muscle synergies and you want to coordinate them, but you also have to know how they behave if they get stretched to their limit. And so a lot of times you'll see these robots like collapse, and maybe that's partially because they don't have that information. And yeah, like Jesse said, a kind of progressive attunement. Yeah. And then Erin said cost. And then Erin said, I wonder about different personality strategies for learning, Gestalt approach systems, systems thinkers, systemic thinkers, various kinesthetic feedback, etc. Systems that include a lot of libraries or are isolated, like Jungian lens for differentiating design. Yeah. I mean, they're different. Well, I mean, usually, I don't know if anyone's written about motor learning and personality differences, but I mean, certainly, like, there is an amount of practice that you have to put into it. And of course, in martial arts, you have like focus and other things like that are very important. Motivation and focus or whatever. So, like, focus is very important in terms of being able to be disciplined enough to learn like these very boring to learn skills and being able to really get it to a high level of performance. Then let's see, proprioception of self-awareness relative to self or environment. And then Jesse said Avery's allostatic kinds from indigenous somewhat would be relevant. Some things in development there are noted. Yeah, we talked about that on Saturday in our meeting about the allostatic kinds work.
Yeah, one thing that I'm going to attempt to translate, and again, Avery's not here, and some of us might know different kinds of related theories that Avery would be mentioning, but one of the Avery things, I'll do it. I can show it. This is easy enough to show. Okay. There's no words here yet, but just as the fun thing to show, and because I put so much work into this computer stuff. Also, Erin, I think you're not muted if you wanted to be muted. I don't know if you do. Yeah. There's a what do we got here? Oh yeah, I was going to show that. So this is like the latest version of some things, like ontological taxonomy of information affordances. Sounds very broad, but between this and some things from like the Diginest space or whatever, it's not a great way to show some of the. I got to link these other things here yet, but I'm mentioning that in the sense of Avery's looking at some aspects of like psychological upsidedness, and in the meeting, I don't have an easy way to show it. I'll just close this up. In the meeting Saturday, I was able to pull up some of the old allostatic kind slides, and things from like I think it was 2021, 22, and how there's kind of been a nice revisiting and emergence of that, because Avery's sort of looking into that. I think that might there's a little bit of overlap between that. It's not quite, it's personality adjacent, but definitely from the premise that there's a non-uniform way of processing stuff and probably processing information at larger, and then maybe learning, and even I'd be curious if there's ever a way to get to testing and things are fleshed out enough. And the non-uniformity of even how the attuning happens that we just talked about, even the progressive attuning, the environmental interaction, and how different agents would want to, the things that they're poking around with to get the feedback that they want. I had a really interesting talk with Avery. The last thing I'll say, we can move on. Friday night, it was the unexpected one, which I mentioned Saturday was like sort of a jam session, unplanned recording. But in it, there was a lot of seeds that are kernels of popcorn that are being popped, if you will, or hoping to be popped around some of what's being talked about. And there's a lot of cool things, but I'm can't think of them all right now. So we can come back to the main topic.
Yeah, I think that's kind of interesting about getting the feedback you want. I mean, you think about it as like maybe like something that's intentional or something that's like requires a high level of focus. Okay. But really it's about like just exploring your environment and finding things that are better than other. Like in C. elegans, you have an environment, the natural environment in C. elegans. You have a lot of different chemical signals. Like they basically root around in the soil looking for bacterial food sources, and they hang around with there's a lot of rotting fruit. That's their key environment. So they go through the soil column and they use different chemical signals and chemical gradients to find those food sources. Well, there are differences in like maybe the quality of the food source or the intensity of the food source that they need to make a decision about as they're expending energy to move there. So those are all decisions you're making as you're getting and they're decisions about feedback. We don't think about it that way.
Yeah.
It's not just about like, oh, I'm making a value judgment. It's about this is the feedback that I need or I want. And so then that affects later behavior because that's that dynamical system. As you kind of move in that direction, everything kind of aligns with that. And right.
Go ahead. Sorry.
Oh no, I'm done.
This is where you reminded me enough, and I think I mentioned this Saturday. But this is it. Like you called out feedback, and essentially some of what Avery's getting at is the non-uniformity or the different weights in feedback perception of itself that might lead to different. It's sort of like almost like a meta phenotype type thing. I don't suppose to say it's as rigorous as like some worms don't deal with this kind of information at all in worm state or in human analogies, but I think there's something to feedback, as in the 1943 paper, as in behavior purpose teleology, as in distance from goal, measuring from the goal negatively, as in behavior, as in all that stuff. And then trying to get at some of the, for lack of a better term, different weightings of it all. So I think that's what sort of come up in the conversation there, and it's nice. I keep referencing Avery, hey, check this out here, and so hopefully, that's right, Wednesday, we have our cognition futures. If anybody interested in this, you can come Wednesday at noon, and in the main Saturday morning S&M space. We'll talk more about some of these things then, put that way.
Yeah, put a pin in that. Erin had another comment. I'm a Manova devotee for development. So this is Manova, like ANOVA, the version of Manova, or ANOVA that's Manova. Yeah. This is analysis of variance. How much the agent accesses libraries, how many libraries exceed degree of integration. Yeah, and you do have a memory of every. So like feedback is dependent on a memory as well. So if you remember that some sort of feedback is positive or negative, it might affect how you follow that feedback. And yeah.
Yes, and as you're saying more, I'm thinking more of Avery's stuff. So I will say, Avery was particularly interested in if you say memory or like stored or accrued in Avery's language, archetypical spaces. And I don't know if we can go into like 11's done a lot of stuff with like platonic space lately, like generic spaces, generic parts on a generic map of like where where in an idea or in a platonic space is the idea or the concept or the weight or whatever located. And I think Avery is looking at the generation of the different weights in the memories, if you will, the for lack of better terms, priors, or just the trove of things that would accumulate after certain, you could say, biases or preferences, or like leanings of some kind, and how that would lead to, for lack of better terms, specialization or preferences, and sort of what are the benefits of having increasing specialization, and the weaknesses, and how are those weaknesses accounted for, and stuff like that. Yeah. So more later.
Yeah, and then Erin mentioned that there was this collective aspect, like, communication between individuals or agents, and they share information about feedback. Like, this is like the idea of stigmergy in social insects, where ants will lay down a pheromone, and then they're trying to move towards a food source, so they lay down a pheromone as they explore, and as they find food, you end up with like these paths that are reinforced by pheromone deposits, and then eventually you get these more efficient paths towards the food source. So yeah, there's this whole literature on stigmergy, and people simulate this in like swarm algorithms and other types of things like that. If you go into that literature, they talk about stigmergy and how you can implement this in an algorithm, search algorithm, to improve performance. But also, in social behavior, it's very important. STIGMERGY. All right, so let me go on to the next paper. So this one talked about using curriculum-based reinforcement learning, basically using policy, a low-dimensional policy, to reinforce this curriculum learning. Now, this paper here is on having a transformer policy. So this is Arnold. This is their platform, a generalist muscle transformer policy. This is from the archive, and it's from a group at EPFL in Switzerland. So this is a very similar paper in terms of modeling the musculoskeletal system in the human body. So the abstract reads, controlling high-dimensional and nonlinear musculoskeletal models of the human body is a foundational scientific challenge. Recent machine learning breakthroughs have heralded policies that master individual skills like reaching, object manipulation, and locomotion in musculoskeletal systems with many degrees of freedom. So this is another thing we didn't talk about in the last paper, is that a lot of these systems, as you coordinate these muscles, they allow for movement, but they're kind of restricted in terms of their degrees of freedom. Muscle synergies, often will take, when you're doing this motor babbling and development, you're taking a system with a lot of uncoordinated degrees of freedom, and you're learning the degrees of freedom that are sort of important for generating the desired movements. So like the goal-oriented movements aren't just like thrashing your body around, it's operating within a restricted number of degrees of freedom. So moving forward, moving backwards, moving your arm in a certain way, moving your leg in a certain way, and it's, you can't just move it anywhere. You have to kind of have those degrees of freedom coordinated. But there are many degrees of freedom in a musculoskeletal system. So as you can imagine, if you have a muscle synergy, it's like 5 or 6 muscles. Those all have their own degrees of freedom, and they have to be coordinated. Sometimes they're uncoordinated. Like I said, if you get injured and you have to compensate using another muscle, that's another degree of freedom you have to learn. And so there are all these degrees of freedom you have to master. Sometimes you have to suppress certain degrees of freedom. Sometimes you rely on other degrees of freedom, and so forth. And of course, when I say degrees of freedom, I mean like in the statistical sense, where you have like one sort of axis of movement forwards and backwards, and then there's another axis of movement side to side, and those are 2 degrees of freedom. So that's what I mean by that. However, these agents are merely specialists, achieving high performance for a single skill. So a lot of times if we're training on a certain movement, that's a single skill. And in an artificial system, we'll often train maybe a robot to do one thing. So if you see these dancing robots, they may look very complicated in terms of their movements, but they can only do that one thing that they're programmed to do. They work very hard to train it just to do that thing. And like if you've ever seen the Boston Robotics robots that they have, like the big dog and robots like that, basically they have mimicked a certain type of gait, and then they kind of let it loose on the world. And it's a pretty robust movement, but it's based on this one type of oscillation that you know is the motive movement. And so it can walk on four legs. You can kick it and it can recover its gait. They've done videos where they've shown, like, if you kick a robot and you almost knock it over, it comes back up, and it's very stable in that one state for that one skill. But then it can't do other things, right? It can't transfer those degrees of freedom to another skill. So in coordinating all these degrees of freedom, you're basically become a specialist. So this is the problem, is how to generalize those skills. So in this work, we develop Arnold, a generalist policy that masters multiple tasks and embodiments. So now they're trying to develop this generalist policy and not a low-level policy like we saw in the other paper. This one allows for mastering multiple tasks and embodiments. So now you're talking about different bodies. If you want to do this in an artificial system, you might have something that approximates a human body. You might have something that approximates like a dog body, quadruped of some type. You might have it in a different embodiment altogether. And the idea is to be able to transfer those skills to different embodiments. Arnold combines behavior cloning and fine-tuning with PPO. They don't define what that is, to achieve expert or super expert performance in 14 challenging control tasks, from dexterous object manipulation, and this is similar to the balls that we saw in the last paper. So they have these balls in their fingers and they're manipulating them, to locomotion. A key innovation in Arnold's sensory motor vocabulary. So they use this concept, sensory motor vocabulary, which is basically the vocabulary being the different types of movements it can make. A compositional representation of the semantics of heterogeneous sensory modalities, objectives, and actuators. So basically, it's, in programming terms, this is how you program these movements. So you have, when they say compositional, they mean these things have to be put together in a certain order in order for them to be functional. And a lot of, this is a goal of artificial intelligence research, is to have this compositionality. And this is borrowed from linguistics, where if you can make something compositional, in other words, if it can be acquired in stages or in modules, and then you put those modules together, then it's much easier to program it and maintain it. Arnold leverages this vocabulary via transformer architecture to deal with the variable observation and action spaces of each task. This framework supports efficient multitask, multi-embodiment learning, and facilitates rapid adaptation to novel tasks. Finally, we analyze Arnold to provide insights into biological motor control, corroborating recent findings on the limited transferability of muscle synergies across tasks. So this is, kind of their approach to this. And so they're basically talking about, again, reinforcement learning, exploration, curriculum learning, and imitation learning. This is kind of the standard thing for musculoskeletal control policy development. And then they point out, by combining these techniques, previous works have succeeded in controlling biologically realistic models of the human body to reach strong performance for complex tasks such as object manipulation and locomotion. And of course, then they bring up that this is very specialized and limited to one specific problem at a time, or one embodiment, where you need to basically, if you want to transfer that to a new embodiment, or to learn even a very similar task but different task, you need to totally relearn these things from scratch. So this is the benefit of having a compositional system. You can share the low-level components and then refine the high-level components, and you don't have to go back to scratch. You can basically have like a hierarchy of different movements. So running and walking are part of the same hierarchy. It's just that the higher level things, the refinement of those movements, are the things that you would need to learn. This approach complicates drawing systems level conclusions about motor control in humans because specialist policies can reproduce a limited repertoire of motor skills. So and then they talk about Arnold. They show some examples here where you have these musculoskeletal policies. So they have this 3 steps here. The first is on policy behavior cloning. So this is where they're doing finger reaching and other types of manipulation. This is this ball manipulation task. So they have these different movements of the fingers of this robot, and they're kind of cloning those behaviors. So they're cloning finger reach for this bowding task, which is bouncing balls in your fingers. And then they have human embodiments, which is where we take this and we do this human musculoskeletal modeling. So in this case, we're transferring this bowding task to manipulating dice in a hand. So, if you're throwing dice, you're moving around your hand. It's very similar to this ball manipulation task. And so you can you fine-tune that task because it's very similar. You can just simply fine-tune that task for a different type of embodiment, or actually a different type of thing that you have in your fingers. And so this is just basically, this is Arnold. So Arnold is kind of playing a role here, has the environmental inputs, and it's producing these outputs. You have this expert training here, and it's producing similar outputs, and then you have this new state. So you have your environmental state and your updated environmental state, and Arnold is intervening in that. Then fine-tuning is basically where you have your action, you have your environment, you have your states and rewards, and then Arnold is reinforcing that into a new action. So it's considering the rewards of good movements and then compiling that into refined actions. And then there are the motion and manipulation tasks. So this is a pen reorientation where you move a pen around in your fingers and you shift it around to get a better grip. There's the elbow pose and relocation, so you're moving your arm around. And so this is where you have these environmental inputs. You have multiple instances of Arnold kind of evaluating, and then you have these new states generated by the policy. So that's, the specialized Arnolds, which are in step 3, become the new experts. So you start with an expert that's not Arnold in policy behavior cloning. In step 3, self-distillation, you have these multiple instances of Arnold, which serve as the experts. So once they learn through reinforcement learning fine-tuning, they can then do this themselves. They become the experts and can refine the movements. So the specialized Arnolds become the new experts. The original Arnold model from step 1 is then updated to imitate these improved experts. Overall, this creates a feedback loop where Arnold learns from improved versions of itself. So it models the task and improves upon the task, and it keeps going down that path. And this is, I guess this is both good and bad in a sense, because it's good because you learn that task in a compositional manner. But it's also bad because if it's like something that's maladaptive, and they don't show that here, but if it's a maladaptive movement, then, and this happens sometimes if you're like recovering from an injury, you might not learn the proper way to walk after you injure your leg, and you end up with some suboptimal movement like a limp or something. And sometimes that's a matter of not learning the movement correctly. And so this is a very important thing when they rehabilitate people, is to get them to learn the movement correctly. So that's kind of the model that they use. So their contributions here are fourfold. So they have this generalist transformer policy that succeeds at 14 motor control tasks. They show that this model, unlike traditional models, can close the gap between student and expert policies, while reinforcement learning fine-tuning can achieve super expert performance, which means it's really, the performance is really good. Arnold can efficiently learn novel control tasks with a fraction of the data necessary for randomly initialized networks. And then we find that within a single task, the muscle activations output by Arnold lie on a low-dimensional subspace of the action space, but that the subspace is not shared across tasks, which we saw in the last paper. So this is why we need to go through all of this to get it to work right. Okay, so that's basically this paper. BC stands for behavior cloning. So you have a student action and an expert action from an initial state. There's this loss between the student and expert, and then that results in your new state, which is then basically the state of the expert. And then the loss is computed between the previous state and the new state. And you try to get the student to minimize that loss. So the student tries to become aligned with the expert. And eventually, if you're successful at the behavior cloning, you'll get a minimal loss, and the student performs very much like the expert. And then there's this on policy behavior cloning. This is where we have we flip this around so that the student is the standard for the behavior, the student action and the expert action. The expert is not aligned with the student. There's a certain amount of loss, and the expert has to minimize its loss to match what the student is doing. So that's kind of on policy behavior cloning versus behavior cloning. So OBC versus BC. And so this just goes through the different tasks. This shows these different tasks here. This figure 5 shows these different tasks. So you have elbow pose, pen reorient, walk to point, ring reach, middle reach, bowing, which is this ball balancing task, and object relocation. So and the dice reorientation. So you have this set of tasks, and they show these lines here. So these are basically the level of performance around this circle. So you see that the blue function is Arnold. That's their approach, and it maximizes performance in all of these tasks. Whereas you have PPO, which is here, where it doesn't do very well in these bowing and dice reorientation and object relocation tasks. It does well on the reach tasks and the elbow pose. And so it's specialized towards those types of tasks. Then BC, which is another, we talked about BC, that does well on pen reorient, die reorient, object relocation, maybe a few of the bowing tasks, and some of the pose and reach tasks. So you see that like Arnold is sort of the best approach. And then the single task experts are kind of out towards the edge along with Arnold. But of course, these are single task experts. So they get trained on a single task and they know that task, but it's not transferable. So Arnold allows for a transfer. Okay, so that's all for that paper, I think. Let me go through the comments again. Yeah. So yeah, stigmergy. There we go. And Erin came up with a reference here. I have to read this. And then, it's, I guess, a review of calculus for machine learning. Then Erin says, reminds me of dependent clauses in complex sentences. Yeah, there's a link here again between language learning and large language models and this kind of musculoskeletal learning and composition. So that's something to think about too. We need to be gathering data for differently sized embodiments and different proportions. That's actually quite an important point. And, they're talking about different embodiments here. in terms of like configurations of like robots. But yeah, this variation in embodiments is very important because a lot of times the behavior is dependent on the embodiment. They don't really specify that as part of the learning process here, but because they only use a robot hand. But if you were to change embodiments radically and you had the same program, could you learn similar tasks? There's been a lot of interesting work on reaching with the human arm, which has a limited number of degrees of freedom compared to an octopus arm, which has a lot more degrees of freedom because it's a set of muscle ganglia that kind of are coordinated in different ways. So if you've ever seen an octopus move, they move their arm and they twist it around an object and they pull it towards them, or they twist it around multiple objects to move them. They have a lot of interesting movements that humans don't have in our arms, and as a result, the embodiment is different. The learning of that motor control is different. So that's a very important point. Okay. And then, then Jesse mentioned the genomic bottleneck, which is something we talked about in our Saturday meeting. But kind of applies here because it's how, the outcomes of, say, like a genomic encoding, or, I think in a lot of the developmental AI literature, they talk about innate features and what can you hard code into an agent, and still have it be able to acquire and learn new things. So you could hard code behaviors into an agent. The agent would be really brittle, but it would know everything it needs to know, as opposed to having the agent learn everything where it's naive and it maybe it takes a long time to get started, but it can learn things. So there's this balance between innateness and learning that has to be in place. And so that's an important part of this idea of, we want to learn things, but we also have different embodiments that we kind of come with. And in fact, are important to fix because, if you want to build a reacher or some other specialized robot, you need to have the right embodiment. Okay, so I think that's all for today. Do we have any questions or comments?
No, I'm glad that this happened. It's nice. I'm glad that Erin could join, but also it's fun to see the slow. It's like multiple pots starting to brew on the stove top.
Yeah.
So that's fun to see that again. And thank you for going over all the things. I know I talked to Erin elsewhere. She enjoyed it, so hopefully I can get her to come back more often. We'll see.
Yeah, that'd be great. All right. Thank you. See you next week.